What is perhaps the most intriguing psychological theory ever produced is that of Julian Jaynes' hypothesis of the bicameral mind. To understand the full scope of this idea, we need to do some heavy speculation. Unfortunately, in this realm of trying to understand consciousness, this strange feature we possess that we can scarcely even identify, there's not really any good empirical science to actually test where it came from or how it developed, or most importantly, why it developed. So let's get right into the meat of that. Let's start with a basic assumption. We can assume, and I hope you're with me here, that there is a point along our evolutionary history where we did not have consciousness. I say we, not necessarily meaning Homo sapiens. They say Homo sapiens have been around for about 200,000 years. Is it possible that we've had consciousness that entire duration? Maybe, and we can never really know, yet at the very least before 200,000 years ago, whoever our primordial ancestors were walking around back then, there is a point in time where we definitively did not have consciousness. It's a very safe assumption. It even accommodates for different definitions of consciousness. No matter how you define the word, unless you're one of the crazy panpsychists, whom I don't believe are worth entertaining. I've already made a video explaining why panpsychism is just wrong. It's worse than wrong, actually. It's not even really a meaningful conjecture. Unless you're one of these fringe theorists, no matter how you define consciousness, there is some point along our ancestral history where we did not possess this unusual attribute. Well then, if we make that safe assumption, a very basic question arises naturally. What was the very first trace of consciousness? Surely our ancestors didn't suddenly wake up one morning experiencing the full power of consciousness. Again, we're going to make an assumption, but in this realm of speculative science, it's very unavoidable. We should assume that the development of consciousness is a gradual process. This too is a pretty safe assumption. If you think otherwise, let me know in the comments section. So far we've made two assumptions, both pretty reasonable. One, that there's a point in our history where we did not have consciousness, and two, that the acquisition or development, and those are two distinct possibilities, but I won't get into the weeds of that distinction, that our reception of consciousness was a gradual process, and the reason is because the contrary seems utterly absurd. So let's return to our question then. If consciousness is developed or acquired gradually, what is the very first flicker of light that marks the initial seed of consciousness? Julian Jaynes, as I'm sure you can assume, has an answer. To understand how we get there, let's review a simple example he provides, which illustrates a larger truth. It's something we can all relate to as well, and I think this example serves its purpose very well. Jaynes says when he's driving a car and he knows exactly where he's going, even though he's a conscious being, he's not actually conscious of driving the car. Maybe he's listening to the radio, maybe he's having a conversation with a friend, maybe it's 2025, he's listening to the Joe Rogan Experience. It's not really important what he's doing. The important takeaway is that it's possible to be conscious on something else while driving the car unconsciously. He says, quote, "I am caught up unconsciously, enthralled, if you will, in a total interacting reciprocity of stimulation that may be constantly threatening or comforting, appealing or repelling, responding to the changes in traffic and particular aspects of it with trepidation or confidence, trust or distrust, while my consciousness is still off on another topic," end quote. And this is what the lives of our pre-conscious ancestors were. Even though we're conscious beings, we of course still retain the ability to go unconscious. And we do so all the time. In continuing with the example, Jaynes then adds a new element. It's with this new element we're able to obtain a very compelling clue about the nature and the origin of consciousness. Suppose you're driving along unconsciously, maybe listening to some music or your favorite podcast, then up ahead, you notice there is an accident. A deer ran across the road, causing the first driver to slam on the brakes, and the second driver, who'd been tailgating for miles, crashed into the backside. A small fire has broken out, there's no other cars, the people are outside the vehicles seemingly unharmed, the police haven't arrived yet, you come upon this situation, and what's the very first thing you do? For me, I would hit the button on the radio and turn off the podcast, because before, just driving along as normal, you could get by unconsciously, but now, for some reason, you need to be conscious. So even if you don't turn off the radio like me, you still are suddenly wired into the situation. And so there it is. That's our clue to what consciousness actually is. We can look at the life of an animal, say a squirrel, just so we have a clear image. We can look at the life of a squirrel and see plainly that it would have no need for consciousness. Everything the squirrel does, everything it encounters can be accommodated with the squirrel's unconscious instincts or traumas. In fact, this must necessarily be the case. Instincts here we mean to be unconscious impulses that arise out of genetics, and traumas to mean unconscious impulses arisen out of either operant conditioning or classical conditioning. A squirrel encounters a predator, the squirrel flees, the squirrel encounters an acorn, he brings it back to his little base where he'll hibernate through the winter. Forests do change, yes, but more or less the rules and the sorts of things you encounter tend to remain the same, at least in the short term. In its natural environment, where the squirrel has learned through millions of years of evolution how to survive and thrive, everything that happens is normal. Normal here meaning that it's within the bounds of what we'd expect to see. More so, everything the squirrel encounters, even if it's new, still falls into a particular category that already exists in the squirrel's brain. The squirrel sees a coyote coming. This unconscious mind indicates to him that this is a predator. Accordingly, the squirrel receives cortisol, and its flight instincts are activated, and it scampers up a tree. It's all a natural unconscious process, and it's the same thing when we're driving the car. Even though we don't have instincts that have been sharpened by countless years of evolution to drive a car, which has only existed for a century, we do have an unconscious understanding of the rules and the proper driving etiquette, which allows us to drive unconsciously. Well then, since we in our ancestry once lived our lives in the same unconscious way as the squirrel, what event or moment facilitated the need for the first flicker of consciousness? Whatever might that flicker be? The answer Jaynes provides is rather elegant. Let's take our example earlier. We were driving in the car unconsciously. Everything was going smoothly. Then we encountered the accident, and suddenly it became necessary for consciousness to intervene. What was it? What was it about that scenario that necessitated consciousness? We'll take a moment to consider. I encourage you to pause the video. Well, the reason, according to Jaynes, is because the accident is a novel situation. And we need to understand precisely what that means. When we're driving around, we encounter novel situations all the time, don't we? We drive on new roads, see different cars, take new routes, venture to new and different places. Yes, that may be true, yet the rules of the road remain the same. And these things we're describing, taking new roads, for example, even though the roads may be new, it's still perfectly feasible for us to drive them, operating from an unconscious state of mind. There are lines on the road, there are signs, there are basic conventions that we're long familiar with. Even though we may encounter these things that are new and different, they are still familiar. And in that sense, they are not truly novel. So that's what we mean by a novel situation. Something that's completely unfamiliar, unknown, and something where what we're supposed to do is not completely obvious. A situation that requires decision-making. In the case of the traffic accident, what are you supposed to do here? Do you stop and get out of your car? Do you call the police? Should you be mindful of the threat of violence breaking out between the potentially hostile people who just got in an accident? Is the road clear? Is there anything in my car I could use to put out the fire? Ideally, you do all these things and help however you can. I think we can agree. Yet since this scenario is totally unexpected, a total wild card, if you will, consciousness is necessitated to actually make the decision. It cannot be one of those automatic processes where we described earlier. So there we have the Jaynes hypothesis, which is just a small part of his total theory, that consciousness arises somehow out of the need for us to make decisions in novel scenarios that we cannot fully grasp, by default with our ordinary faculties, that being the unconscious mind. By the way, as a small side point, it's worth mentioning here that the unconscious mind is really massive in scope. Consciousness always gets so much tension. For me anyway, I've tended to have this vague notion in my head that our minds are 50% conscious and 50% unconscious. And I would never put that as a claim or anything. It was just this sort of general understanding I had. Well, this idea is completely wrong. The unconscious accounts for a vastly higher percentage of the brain's functioning. Indeed, as we said, for a super majority of our history, we only had the unconscious mind. This name that we have for it, the unconscious mind, seems, to me anyways, to diminish the true, essential, and fundamental role this thing plays in our lives. For the longest time, it was just the mind. Anyways, I just wanted to make that clear. Maybe I'm alone, but maybe you all can relate to what I'm saying here. The unconscious mind plays a much greater role than we give it credit for, and the way we discuss it and treat it should be reflected as such. So if you've made it this far into the video, I know by default you're the sort of person who's interested in thinking deeper about things. I hope you'll subscribe and stick around because we want more people like you here. If you're interested at all in some free coaching, click the link below. I help people meet their goals, develop methods and schedules, and also integrating all of it with personal journaling and or meditation, reading skills. It's a good time. We have some good conversations. I'll get some experience and you'll perhaps learn something from me. So there's one final thing I'd like to leave you with. Let's take this notion as an assumption that perhaps it's really true what Jaynes says about novel situations being the very thing that engenders consciousness. Well, if your goal as a human being is to become more conscious, and I'm not saying it should be necessarily, but I tend to think that way, that consciousness is a good thing. Well, if that's the case, how do you do it? It follows, if you want to make yourself more conscious, you should make an effort to voluntarily insert yourself into novel situations, going to new places, talking to new people, listening to new music. Give all this a try and tell me if it's useful. Well, I hope you give it a try. Leave some feedback in the comments, and thanks for watching. That's all.